Now, before I begin, I think it's important to say that as we face these challenging issues, we recognize issues, real human problems and we come together in this room, this Zoom room, bearing the marks of pain about us. And so we don't take this lightly, and we remember that indeed there are people we know or know of who are afflicted by the plague, who are afflicted by COVID, who are affected by the economic downturn and the challenges that we face. And so, of course, we enter into this prayerfully and remembering that there is this is not just an abstraction, but we're dealing with significant pain. So we do that, and hopefully we'll be able to do that as we also enter into the question time. So as Liz has said to you, Augustine has been a long focus of mine. I had the opportunity in graduate school, not intending actually initially to study Augustine, but I had the opportunity to study with two of the great British scholars of Augustine, Gerald Bonner and Robert Marcus, and the opportunity to work under a great mind that is Augustine's, under great students of Augustine, was too great of an opportunity to pass up. And it has borne fruit for me over the years, and I'm delighted to share some of that. Most of my work has often been in his cosmology and views of Genesis, but one cannot deal with that without dealing with these broader sets of issues. So a reset perhaps for fraught times. Notice the question mark. I think I want to say to you at the beginning, as we enter into this conversation, this is a conversation, and I'm suggesting Augustine as a way to think and to bring and to critique our own times. No time stands on its own. Indeed, that other great scholar, that Lewis, that Jonathan spoke of several weeks ago, reminds us that we need this fresh sea breezes of history to blow through and challenge our own time so we don't become preoccupied thinking our way of viewing something now is the only way. So as we enter into this study and reflection on Augustine, it's not to say that he's right and we're wrong, or we're right and he's wrong. It's that here's a very different way of thinking, perhaps. Well, it is, I think, a very different way of thinking. It's a challenging way of thinking. It's one that has influenced many, and worth our while to put it into contrast to our own ways of thinking, to use this to challenge ourselves, to rethink, to ask, are we handling this the best way we can? Are there alternatives that we might consider? So it's to bring Augustine into conversation, hence the question mark. Well, I don't know about your images. If this were a normal classroom where I had a group of people all around me, I could ask for people to raise their hands and what do you remember of Augustine? What have you read? And there would be a variety of answers. Many will have read the Confessions. A few will have read The City of God. Probably only a very few will have read the whole of The City of God, a work that he called his great and arduous work, and not without reason. But I thought it would be helpful just to get some of the images, the ways people have conceptualized about Augustine over time. And maybe you could identify with or put yourself into one of these frames. So here's the Augustine of the Renaissance. You see the intellectual, the scholar bishop reflecting on the world in Carpaccio's vision. Or here, maybe for some of you, Augustine is more of an abstraction. And so here's a book template, but in that book template, it is an abstract vision of Augustine, and you see him in a cathedra in his bishop's chair of sorts that represented the 12th century. Not much sense of identity or personality. And maybe that's the Augustine for you, somebody who really lacks much personality. Continuing on, maybe the Augustine for you is this quite mighty figure, the second from the left on the bottom, inscribing a book. So quite the great author. That might be your image of Augustine. Or for many of you, perhaps Botticelli's great painting in Firenze, in Florence, showing that passionate Augustine. Often he's represented with a heart. So one of the icons you see with Augustine is a heart, for the heart aflame because of his passion. Here's the passionate Augustine. So for many, that's perhaps it. Or maybe for some of you, it's this, the mighty, powerful Augustine, the hammer of God, bringing it down on Pelagius and others, those he fought with. So perhaps it's Augustine, the fighter that you imagine. For some of you, it might be this, Augustine, the preacher. This is from the Vatican, from the four doctors, the statues of the four doctors at the high altar. Perhaps this is the Augustine that you know or think of. For me, this is the Augustine that I imagine. This was John and I together had a chance to go see this it was down in archaeological dig underneath the Lateran area under the Scala Sancta, and this is the earliest image we have of Augustine, perhaps, only perhaps, with a face based on his signet ring has been suspected, so that perhaps the image we see there of his face has a degree of realism to it. That's suspected, it's possible, it's a nice thought, but it does give you a sense of what a church leader looked like in the time of, relatively to the time of Augustine in his cathedral, that is in his bishop's chair. And you notice the scripture there on a desk in front of him. I suspect for many, this might be one of the dominant images of Augustine. And it's an interesting one. And let me tell you why. And perhaps what you bring into this conversation, or what at least many have brought into the conversation over time. Because actually that's not an image of Augustine. That's his sometime student Orosius. Orosius, who studied under him, and at his behest wrote a book of history of Rome to accompany the city of God, completely misunderstood Augustine's theology, miswrote it, misrepresented it, and created the theology that shaped Alcuin of York and Charlemagne in creating the Holy Roman Empire, which arguably was not very holy, not very Roman, and not much of an empire. And yet they did it, created this notion of an empire predicated on, we are following Augustinian theology. Well, Augustine's City of God, if you haven't read it, it's rewarding, but it's a hard work to work through. And so when there was an easier book, it served as a bit like the Cliff Notes of its era. Many read Orosius and took Orosius as representing Augustine's thought, even though what he gave was actually largely 180 degrees different, completely misunderstanding his master and misrepresenting his position about history, society, and especially Rome. Let me just give you a quick little background before we move in. I am a historian, so context matters. A text, was my father, who was a historian, used to always say to me, a text without a context is a pretext. And so lest we get into a pretext, let's just remember the period. So the period of leading into Augustine, I'm going to just pick up very briefly in the 3rd century because it sets up so much. The 3rd century was a period of constant civil war. In that period of 235 to 270 AD, a 35-year period, there were 70 emperors, only one of whom died of natural causes. That is, it was one long civil war with one emperor attacking another or having his minions attack on his behalf and rising to the throne. And war changes the culture, have no doubt. War changes the way a society sees the world around it and reacts. For somebody who's watched Europe and North America for many years now, it's really evident how much the last 20 years with the kind of war, the language of a war footing and war culture has come to dominate, particularly within North America. The way that has affected many of our cultural manifestations today, many of the conversations, the political issues are defined profoundly, I would say, by a culture of a war footing. And that was certainly the culture of the 4th century. It was shaped by this long civil war that engaged Roman times. At the end of this civil war, in the midst of the civil war, at multiple points, Christians experienced persecution, because often when you're at war, you look for who's at fault, who's different, who is varying from society and therefore must be causing us trouble. And the Christians often were that. And sometimes it was presented as religious persecution. It was a kind of religious persecution, but I think often we need to be careful to understand the persecutions of the Christians at the time. It wasn't really so much an anti-Christian polemic as it was an anti-alien polemic. They're different than us. They're breaking down our society. They are changing who we are. And out of that, persecutions came. Now, it's more complex. That's a quick summary, but it's a profoundly important one to understand the period. And into that, then you have varieties of civil war. You have Diocletian reorder the empire. That's where we get the divisions between Eastern and Western Europe and Mediterranean. You have yet another civil war and persecution under following Diocletian. And at the end of this, or bringing this period of summation, you have this young upstart out of York, England, Constantine, march on Rome, and win a battle, vastly outmanned at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, attacking Rome, so both fortified position and the River Tiber to protect Maximian and the antagonists, and yet Constantine won. And he won by using this, he said, and others thought around him, and indeed it was used, using the sign of Christ, using the ancient key rho sign. It looks a bit like the cross. And so he won a battle he shouldn't have won. And you can imagine the Christians, having just come through horrific persecutions, rallied to his banner as their man, their emperor, the person who is going to protect them and represent them and move them forward in life. And over the course of the next century, you had initially had Constantine taking a number of actions critical to the development of the time that represented good imperial politics, but to the Christians represented wonderful Christian opportunities. So you have laws against paganism being initiated, suppressing paganism over time. You had Constantine calling church councils, first a council against the Donatists, and then the Council of Nicaea. So many of us in this room will reflect upon and use the Nicene Creed at various times. Well, this came out of the council that Constantine called. Move that forward to Theodosius, and the first Theodosius the Great in 386. At that point, he made Christianity the formal singular state religion. What a transformation, what a change. And you can put yourself into the image of the time. To be a historian, you have to have imagination and empathy. Imagine yourself into the world in which they lived and understand the world through their perspective. This was transformative for them. And they rallied around the Imperium as representing them. And many came to think of Rome as part of God's economy. That because of this, God intended and changed Rome and made it a Christian state, that these were Christian times that God had intended. Well, from the time of Theodosius, almost immediately from the time of Theodosius, you have a whole series of other civil wars and problems, and you have Germanic tribes waging war with them on the north. And you have the appropriation of Germanic tribes as mercenaries. And one of those mercenary groups, the Visigothic tribes, because they weren't paid, if you're going to hire mercenaries, quick lesson, pay them. Because they weren't paid, in part, marched down on Rome and sacked Rome because Rome hadn't fulfilled their obligation. And so the unimaginable happens. Rome had been sacked since the Gauls sacked Rome in 386 BC. So almost 800 years, Rome had been not free from violence, because to be sure, Rome was a very violent society, but free from attack from outsiders. Well, into this comes Augustine. He is somebody who is one of the most extensive writers in history, wrote some 93 books, delivered somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 sermons, of which we have 950 approximately still available. I spend most of my work looking at these and studying these sermons. And we have 300 of his letters still extant that is still available. It's a massive set to look at. This is, by the way, the images here walking in to see this famous fresco through the archaeological site. So here are Augustine's key dates. So you see the picture I've just represented to you, the 4th century. Augustine is born right into this, born in 354, died in 430. He is engaged in the midst of a poignant and significant time. It was a time in which evil is understood as being something quite particular, concrete, and quite external. So to put yourself in the context of the Christians of the time who were persecuted and experienced persecution from the state. Who's your enemy? Well, that's pretty evident, isn't it? It's the state. They tended to very much externalize and concretize evil as something that's out there that attacks us. There was also a notion of Roman political philosophy. It's really critical this time, the Pax Deorum, or the peace of the gods. The Romans, who were very right-oriented, right as in R-I-T-E, that is the way you practice your religions, not so much creedal, if you will, as right-oriented, thought that one could determine the world around you based on the structures that you see, that you could read in the divine purposes into the world around you. And if all is right with the God, worshiping the God, then we will experience peace. If there is disharmony in society, it's reflective of the fact that somebody is worshiping the gods wrong. There isn't harmony between some group and God. So you can see in the midst of civil war, they're going to look around for who's worshiping the gods wrong, which group is not maintaining the rights that maintain the peace. The Pax Romana becomes very important, and it becomes very significant because we'll be seeing shortly how early Christian political thought, essentially after the time of Constantine, essentially adapted and drew in the notion of the Pax Romana and baptized it as a Christian theology. We shouldn't be under any illusion, both in pagan Roman times or Christian times, that Rome was a brutal society in many ways. You know about gladiators, surely, but it represents this brutality that was a part of Roman governance. Every civil war in Rome represented it. Many paid their lives with it. Into this context, you then have, as I've said, Constantine winning a battle he shouldn't have won, proclaiming it as a Christian, and being the first officially noted Christian emperor. And a court theologian, a man who became quickly his court theologian, Eusebius, and wrote a history about it, very much adapted. And it's interesting, you read his church history, he specifically makes the Christianization of Rome, the conversion of Constantine, and the Christianization of Rome as part of the divine plan. So he reads in and believes he can see the divine plan, the divine stages, what God intended, and that Roman roads would spread the gospel. God obviously intended this and is using it for his purposes. And that sets up a history of conversation. Now, the 4th century is far more complex and convoluted than this. So let's not be naive about this. I'm giving you a very simplistic overview for the sake of these few minutes. Paired with Ambrose, advance this even further. I'll come back to that. So there is a sense of a great Christian triumphalism, a sense of a sudden collapse of the persecution of the pagan order, directed by providence, the adaptation of the Pax Deorum. And so you now have the Christians looking for the peace of not the gods, of the God, as a part of Roman political philosophy. Look at these quotes from Prudentius, who was a court poet. His poems still are used in many Christian hymns. You can find in traditional hymn books where they will list the authors. You can still find Prudentius's hymns in the back of many of them, and making up hymns that maybe some of you have sung. So let's go to the last one because of time. Now all mankind is united under the rule of Remus. Remus, you may remember, is one of the two brothers, the mythical founders of Rome. Customs once diverse, now agree in speech and thought. This was destined in all, this is the law of the Christian name might bind with all one time. All with one time. I mean, look at it. You had this sense of this profound change. As a historian, I could never imagine a 2nd century Christian writing something like this, or a 3rd century. It's completely unimaginable that prior times would have written something of this sort. They couldn't have imagined or imagined it interpreting Rome in this way. Now, I said briefly a moment ago about Ambrose and Theodosius. Famously, Theodosius, who you may remember I said proclaimed Christianity as the sole great religion, also was the emperor and had, after an uprising, put a whole village to death to the sword. And Ambrose famously, the Bishop of Milan, which was then the capital of the empire, would not let him into church to worship, and educated him not so much as emperor, but as a Christian, as a son of the church, until he confessed, would not let him take communion. But this set up a tradition that shaped the relationship between church and state. It came into the time of Augustine. And some of you will recall that Ambrose, indeed, the person through whom Augustine converted in part. So, 410 AD, we have the sack of Rome. For 3 days, the Gothic tribes run riot through Rome. taking back them. Only 2 responses I'm aware of from that time in particular. There are a couple of other minor ones, but one, you have Jerome, St. Jerome, who was the author, only offered this plaintive cry, in Rome can perish, what can be safe? And that's all we get from Jerome about the sack. In this time, there is a sense of this great Roman exceptionalism. Rome was a symbol. It was the city. It had been attacked for 800 years. Rome, the Goths, I'm not sure they were thinking about Roman exceptionalism themselves. They were just thinking about getting their money. But for the Romans, this was unimaginable. Because of the sense of Roman exceptionalism, Rome was something special in the history of the world. It had a unique place. And this was unimaginable. This exceptionalism caused them to be unable to engage with others very well. So, in fact, anyone who didn't have Roman citizenship was called a barbarian. And that word, it's, I can't think of the linguistic basis for the word barbarian. There's a great word for it. If Jonathan were live, he could tell us it, I'm sure right now. But a barbar, it's the verbal sound that they can't, all they can do is garble. It's like saying they're garblers. It's a word of derision. And anyone, you were either a Roman or a barbarian. It was a derisive word that they thought about others because Romans were exceptional. And they treated this was a period of mass migrations, and that was part of the problem, part of the challenge. And Romans' reaction to that, again, set this up. And I've already described this sense of a new intimate link to the gospel. And so in response to this, when Rome was sacked, you had the intellectual and popular dismay. And while Jerome could only give us the plaintive cry, Augustine gave us something more. He gave us the City of God, his great and arduous book. And what is it? Why is it that Augustine was different? Why could he step into the issue in a way that others had failed to, beyond a plaintive cry? Well, the first, I think, really critical one is the work that Augustine had done, going back to the mid-390s. Through a series of works, he began thinking through the problem of evil. And that way of conceptualizing things, the way he wrestled through the problem of evil, set him up theologically, culturally, and politically to reimagine Roman society and offer a different response. Now, what he did is rethought evil not as a thing, but as nothing. Evil is not a thing in Augustine understanding. This is called privation theory. Those with philosophical training in the room will recognize it. Evil then as a corruption. It's not a real thing in its own right. It's the destruction, the undoing, the unmaking of a good thing. God creates good. Creation out of nothing is the creation of good things. Evil is the slow or relatively quick destruction of good things. It's destructive. It unmakes it. Some of the Oxford fantasists pick up on this. So for those of you, so many of you will have read Tolkien or watched the movies. Where do orcs come from? Well, they are corrupted elves, right? There is that sense of corruption, that unmaking. I love riding my cycle around Oxford. I cycle an awful lot. It's one of my great areas of enjoyment. And as you've already heard in the introduction from Liz Bajan, Oxford is a rainy place and a lot of rain. It means my city bike has a very rusty chain. Even though it's rusty, that is, it's corrupted. It's privated, though, however, and this is really critical to understanding Augustine's thought, I can still use that bicycle, even though it squeaks, even though because I like things that work well. I despise riding this because as the chain squeaks, but as it squeaks, I think, okay, at least nobody's gonna steal it. So my privated bike still has a viability. And so Augustine, rethinking privation theory, understands, bringing in privation theory rather, and giving it a deeply Christian base, re-understands the problem of evil. It's no longer a thing. It's not the state. It's not even the demons. Now they're deeply corrupted things because for him, remember, they're corrupted angels. It's not demons of themselves that are problem of evil. The problem of evil is something more underlying and structural that alters us because we have given ourselves over to something, not God. He understands critically as well the doctrine of creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo. And rejecting the dualism of the Manichees that had been so important to him for a time, and he had found attractive for some 10 years offering explanatory power, he comes to reject it because it automatically treated the physical world as somehow innately evil. The world around for Augustine, whether it be physical things like my computer that I'm using, or my bicycle I'm on, or the rock, it's just the created world. The issue becomes more about how I use it, what I do with it. It is about the qualities, not the thing in its own right. And this causes him, importantly, to rethink the nature of the image of God, the imago Dei. Before that, he thought, as many do, and he still finds these two approaches today, that the image of God was something that was somehow completely lost at the fall. And in thinking through privation theory, you can imagine where this is going. The image of God is something that's corrupted by the fall. There's still something of it left that can be rejuvenated. There's also something left that can still represent something of the divine, even by people who don't recognize and react and honor the divine. There is still some fragment left. So it's an important term, and you can't understand what he's doing in the city of God. Indeed, you can't understand what he does with language or hermeneutics or culture, or so many other aspects of life, or his understanding of the nature of the church without reference to privation theory, because he understands it as a removal of core goods, even as some degree, even if it's minimal, some minimal degree of good is left. And so as a result of this, we are deformed, dislocated, and divided. We as humans have a corrupted nature, differing and degraded from our original form due to the original volitional act, which separates us from God and sets a separation. But even though there's still something of the good left, there is still this separation. And with this, Augustine makes then this, what is often described as the inward turn. So the divided self, we're dislocated, we're alienated. And I'm alienated first from God. If I can't get along with God, I'm alienated from myself. If I can't get along with myself, how am I going to get along with you? So I'm alienated from others. And I'm also alienated from creation, from the cosmos. In all sorts, I experience alienation. Here are just a few quotes that I'll go over spread quickly because I want to, I'll just look at one of these. For the powers of my inner self are veiled in darkness, and I deplore it. When my mind speculates upon its own capabilities, it finds that it cannot safely trust its own judgment. I'm alienated from myself. And if I can't get that about myself, how can I understand what's going on in your head or the world around me? And so we come to the city of God, which I'll handle quite quickly so we have time for conversation, for some questions. As I've said, his was the only substantial response to the challenge. And he offers in this massive book a twofold response, a twofold apologetic. He's responding first to the pagan intellectuals who had a mythic vision of Rome, who said, it is only in Christian times that Rome has collapsed. We have not experienced this before. It's because of you Christians. You are at fault. I'm pointing, that's so rude, but it's part of that rudeness. It's the pagans pointing at the Christians. You have brought this on us. It is only in Christian times that Rome is sacked. And so if you read the City of God or skim it, it's the first half of the book, books 1 to 10, that deal with pagans, both popular paganism and philosophical paganism. But he doesn't leave it there. The second half, books 11 to 22, are a critique of the Christian vision and the misplaced ideals of the Christians that resuscitated the same pagan mythic vision of Rome and had baptized the pagan mythic vision of Rome as an exceptional place. And with it, he offers a view of the civitates peregrina. That's a good Latin term. A literal translation would be resident aliens. A legal translation would be, in North America, somebody with a green card, or for somebody in the UK, to have indefinite leave to remain. It's a legal status that means you're here in society, you have a right to be here, but your full identity is not here. All the while that you're here, with some right, with some ability to participate, with some ability to serve, you do so all the while knowing that your full identity, and therefore your loyalty is elsewhere. The state is not that to which you give your loyalty. Those are strong words, and they challenge ways that we think. And in this, he then posits opposing forces, the city of man versus the city of God. Now these, as he talks about them, are not absolute entities in this life that we can identify. I can't look at my church down the road, St. Andrew's, and say, well, this is the city of God. And I can't look at Whitehall or in the US, the White House and Capitol and say, that's the city of man. The city of God found people that give themselves over wholly and absolutely to the love of God and the will of God. And the city of man are those places, or city of humans are those places that give themselves solely over to their own love, their own desires, rejecting the will and purposes of God. These are absolute eschatological terms. They're not particular temporary terms. So if you look at my church, with apologies if there's anyone in my church who's there, we're not the city of God. We have aspects of the city of God that we hope and pray should demonstrate themselves over time. We have ways of acting with one another and those outside of us that perhaps can, in their moments, represent the grace and mercy of the divine. But we also have our selfishness, our preoccupations, and our greed that represent the city of man. Looking at political society or other cultural entities or educational institutions, it's all the same way of thinking about it. You see different aspects represented. These don't exist in particular absolute forms. I do think it's interesting that he chose city and not kingdom, because so much of the preaching of Jesus is around the kingdom of God. He chose city, picking up on this vision of the city of Rome as a signal and symbol, but he also picks it up because the word civitas also has built into it the notion of society. He's thinking in terms of community, a communal venture. And that's really an important part of what he's doing. So the two cities are neither wholly identified with communities that attempt to follow God or with those that are preoccupied with this present moment of the state or of education or of the arts. They're I can't say the word, inextricably interwoven. So what Augustine challenges us to do is get our categories right. There are two key books, if you want to just go get a sense of this. In ancient books, they're subdivided, ancient works are subdivided into books. So a book is a way of referring to what might be thought of here and now as a very long chapter. So in book 2 of the City of God, Augustine sets out a notion, Cicero's notion of the commonweal or commonwealth. And he argues that Rome never offered one fully. And he tells us in book 2 that he'll get around to telling us more about it. Now, it took until book 19 and about 10 to 12 years of writing before he got around to it. But in it, he, having rejected that Rome was ever a commonwealth, that is, a place that practices full justice. I remember his privation theory, can't get away from this. As a place that practices justice, the commonwealth, as Cicero imagined it, didn't exist. But he subverts that and offers us an alternative vision for this mortal existence. And he offers us a notion that in this life, there is a degree of peace. There is an earthly peace that's possible. And he says in book 19 that those in the church, that we Christians, those who are Christians, seek to make use of the peace of this city in seeking the greater peace. That this city is a kind of shadowy representation, a perverted, privated version of the true peace of God. Likewise, justice. There is no true justice in this world, but Augustine doesn't think there is no justice. That's very clear. Some people think that Augustine didn't think you could have justice in this world, and I think that's quite wrong when you look at book 19, particularly in the later chapters. There's no true justice. That is, vera justitia, that's that sense of full and complete justice. There is not a full and complete justice. There's privated justice, there's privated peace, but we can participate in that. Human justice is flawed when truth is hidden. And so this is interesting. He's reflecting here in book 19 on the role of judges who have, after all, the power of life and death within Roman society and some other societies. In view of the darkness that attends the life of human society, will our wise judge take his seat on a judge's bench? Obviously, he will sit because the claims of society constrain him and draw him to that. Really an interesting sort of statement. Peace is our instinctive aim. We often seek it by imposing our will on others, and we impose it often in very privated ways, he would also argue. We seek to dominate, which is a perversion of the dominion that God created humans to have. Even a perverted peace is better than no peace. We should not confuse it with true peace. Let me bring this quickly to a close so we have a few minutes for conversation. But a household of human beings whose life is not based on faith in pursuit of earthly peace, based on the things belonging to this moral life and on its advantages, whereas a household of humans whose life is based on faith looks forward to the blessings which are promised as eternal in the future, making use of the earthly and temporal things like a pilgrim in a foreign land. Now that pilgrim picks up on that, the language of pilgrim picks up on that word that I used earlier, civitatis peregrina, resident alien. Peregrina, the Latin word out of which we get pilgrim. So we act as pilgrims without a sense of our full identity or loyalty. One can participate, one can contribute to this life, but one should never confuse it. Augustine has restructured the way we see the world if we follow him with it. It's very easy to think about the distinction between good and evil. What Augustine does is gives us a middle ground, the secular. Now for many, over in the various traditions, the word secular has a very negative ring. Augustine isn't using it that way. He sets it as this middle framework because the saeculum is that which is created. It's the world that God has given us. The saeculum is the noun form, out of which we get secular. The saeculum is the creation of the world. It is the space and place in which we live and breathe and have our being. And anything in the saeculum can be used for privated or profane ends. It can be distorted, or it can be used for sacred ends to one degree or another. But it doesn't have an ultimate identity as such in this life. So this resuscitates the saeculum, if you will, because he would not go down the path of dualism like the Manichees he had been a part of for time, who blamed the saeculum for the evil that we experience. The blame lies squarely within our souls. So I'll bring us to a summary. What Augustine gives us is a dynamic tension. The sacred, the secular, and the profane, orienting all things towards loving the true good and using all things for sacred purposes rather than profane, seeking to resolve the alienation of the fall, but not trusting we can do it absolutely in this life. For him, whether we agree with this or not, government has to do its best to minimize conflict and injustice and secure a just balance of sexual interests. And it is in this way that he sees it as having a fundamental place within the divine economy, whether or not it's a Christian government, so-called Christian government, or something else, or under another religion, or a secular. It should seek to minimize conflict, to give, oh, sorry, this sounds like a song, to give peace a chance. So political arrangements for Augustine are always at best inherently problematic, yet we ought to seek them to contain the disorder that shapes our lives. My mentor, one of my mentors, Robert Marcus, I thought put this brilliantly. Augustine's view allowed him to give space to areas of subtler shades. He located the secular in the saeculum, in that intermediate and temporary realm in which human affairs unfold. Sacred and profane were two starkly finalist categories, two ultimate, that is, two eschatological, tied up with salvation, damnation, describe our temporal affairs. And I think that captures that Augustinian sense well. Well, a couple of implications. For Augustine, and I'll end on this slide, Jonathan, history is not canonical. Unlike scripture, it doesn't offer any sort of direct revelation about our times. Hence, one must hold back, sorry, the typo there, one must hold back from asserting the meaning of current events in terms of any larger interpretation of the currents of history. It's the divine purposes, just as the divine purposes for Rome were beyond the Romans to interpret, despite what Eusebius, Ambrose, and others thought, or Orosius, the purposes God had for Rome, indeed God had purposes, but our ability to understand it are too circumscribed, too narrow, too preoccupied with ourselves to actually interpret it. While God is involved in human events, so it doesn't mean that God is absent, these events are far too opaque, and they stymie our attempts to see the divine purpose in history. Now, we can go back to a theological perspective from scripture and revelation and other forms, but history itself isn't. I can't look at a particular place in time in history and say, God was intending this, even as something I care about. People I care about. I can't look at the 14th century and say God was developing the world in this way. I don't have this perspective. I'm part of the process. And therefore, with this, for Augustine, patriotism is a false friend for a resident alien. Loyalty to the state cannot be placed before, alongside, or in context to loyalty to the divine. One can serve and be involved in the state, but one does so with the sense that identity and loyalty are elsewhere. Views of a national exceptionalism that have shown up at other times, and I'll leave you to think about our own times, are a retread of the false Roman ideology challenged by Augustine as antithetical to the Christian message. And I think that's a critical piece for our reflection. And I'll leave that there. Over to you, Jonathan.
That's great. Thank you very, very much, Stan. A great deal that you've shared with us there. Apologies for one or two places I couldn't quite hear what Stan was saying, so we send our apologies from our offices if some of you had problems too. Fortunately, the PowerPoint was very thorough, so there was plenty to see, even if you couldn't quite hear everything all of the time. But now we have just over 10 minutes to think about, to open for questions. So if you have a question, feel free to just drop me a chat, and I will put it to the group, and Stan can see what he thinks about it. So yes, you can use the chat function to send me a question. If you missed anything because of for technological reasons, feel free to ask for clarifications as well. So I thoroughly enjoyed the illustrations at the beginning of the various views of Augustine and his representations in art in particular. He's clearly a very good looking gentleman. And we've got a couple of questions relating to the representation of Augustine. So I'll put these two together. So one question is about his origins. How African do you understand Augustine to be? In particular, how Black African do you understand Augustine? And then we have another question. Are there any pictures of a Middle Eastern Augustine? So I'll hand it over to Stan.
Yeah, great questions. So to both of those, first, Augustine is a North African and out of a Berber stock, and there's still Berbers in Algeria, Tangiers, Libya. And so think of it as a North African ethnic stock that he comes out of. So not Black African, but certainly African and North African. And so would be dark-skinned, olive-skinned, and African. There's an interesting aspect of this because Augustine was also thoroughly Roman. His area, the areas of Africa that he came out of, Numidia, proconsular Africa, were the breadbasket of Roman society. So they were to Rome what the Midwest, in agricultural terms, and in some ways cultural and social terms, they were what the Midwest is to the US in terms of being a breadbasket. North Africa was to Roman society. And so in some ways he was very Roman, and yet he was able to break free from that in a number of ways. So I think he also brings some other sensibilities, which one might describe as African, North African, but in terms of ethnic stock, representing the darker North African tribes. I am not aware of any Middle Eastern images of Augustine. It's a great question. Now you want me to go look for it. One of the great things about being a teacher is you get to learn. And so over the years of doing tutorials here at Oxford, doing these one-on-ones, I always, every time, without fail, one of the junior members that's sitting in the room with me asking me a question in our one-on-one tutorial asked me a fascinating question that I've had several of those that have ended up being articles. I thought, okay, I got to learn about that. And so it's ended up shaping and going into my ongoing research. And so I've not seen a Middle Eastern image of Augustine. Tend not to because of the stronger influence of the Syriac and the Orthodox traditions in the Middle East, where there's been less interest in Latin theology. So I wouldn't expect there to be many, but there doesn't mean there wouldn't be any, and now I need to go find out.
Brilliant, thank you. Let's move on to Orosius. Your portrait of Orosius was rather peculiar looking. I'm not sure. Well, I suppose Orosius is one of these mysterious characters we don't know as much about as Augustine, but we have a question about this Cliff Notes approach to Augustine. So how did Orosius's Cliff Notes distort Augustine's thoughts, and what are some of the areas we might be tempted to do the same today with the City of God, and who does a better job than Orosius at giving us Cliff Notes to the City of God?
Well, two quick responses on that. First off, he went back to the interpretation of Eusebius, and so Orosius envisioned Rome within the kind of notion of Roman exceptionalism that had shaped the 4th century. So it was so profoundly a part of their way of seeing reality. Orosius, though he studied under Augustine somewhat, never got Augustine's position. So he relied on the prior tradition that had shaped so many. Augustine is one of the few to break free from that. And so he returned to the same view of the state that shows up in Eusebius and Ambrose and others, that Rome is exceptional, it's special, it's part of the divine economy. And his history was written in that way. An interesting bit is in the preface to that work, he dedicates it to Augustine and says, something along the lines of, I dedicate this, thank you for asking me to write this history of Rome. And I hope and pray you will use, I'm paraphrasing it badly, but something along those lines. Augustine is fully silent on it. He never comments on that history. So damned to silence, if you will, from Augustine. Who does a better job? Well, Augustine actually in his manual on faith, hope, and charity gives us a précis of his view of the City of God. So his work on faith, hope, and charity had, and I can't recall off the top of my head which chapters of it, I'm sorry, but if you go look at it, it's a much shorter work, about an 8th or 9th or maybe a 10th the size of the City of God. And he's got several chapters that capture that sense. So let's let Augustine be his own Cliff Note. And hopefully what I've given you now has been a little bit of that.
Thank you, Stan. Right, this is an intriguing question about privation theory. So how did Augustine's privation theory, evil being the privation of good, influence his understanding of the physical manifestations of evil, such as the devil or demons?
Well, let me sure, I didn't use an example I might have because of time, but I'll do that now. So here's the poster for today's lecture. For Augustine, privation does this. It's not that I think that little of this, like maybe I do. It's undermined the quality, the integrity of the physical thing has been afflicted. But notice there's still some information here. You can get a sense that there's something going on. Maybe you want to follow up, maybe you don't, but you can get a sense that there's something more to follow up on or pay attention to. So the physical thing is afflicted. It's affected by the privation, that what happens within our soul manifests itself outward and is twisted and undermined our human nature. And for him, the disobedience of the garden meant that humans were separated from the thing that retained their physical perfection, the tree of life. And so there's this degradation that comes out as a result of the twisting that happened within. And this is along a continuum. And so I'm relatively twisted in different ways, depraved, affected, afflicted in different ways. You are, although I'll let you think and speak for yourself on that, to what extent you are, but we're all affected. We all experience this in different ways, and the pain of privation affects each of us in different ways when we're honest about it. But it's also along a continuum. And so for Augustine, some of this can be used. Some of it gets to the point that it's so distorted, it's hard to see how usable it is, or that there's much of any good left. And that's for him how we understand the demonic, is that these were angels that had become so twisted, so devastated, so disoriented, so alienated from the divine, that they are on the far end of it.
Thank you. Questions are flowing in, so I think I'll have to put a stop to the questions coming in, and I'll just ask the last few if Stan can quickly respond.
I'll try and be very quick.
That would be great. Why you said that Augustine was emphasizing community when he called the city of God instead of the kingdom of God. But why did Augustine, if Augustine thought all material and earthly stuff was corrupting, why wouldn't the word city imply it would also be corrupting? So why choose the word city, and isn't that earthly and corrupting in itself?
Well, remember, everything is privated. Everything faces corruption in different ways. So the problem, it's not that we're not going to find corruption different, that we can find places in this life without corruption. We're always going to be finding it. And so for him, it's getting the categories right, setting our expectations that freedom from corruption is something for the next life. We're not going to remake the world around us without corruption. But for him, consummately, the world is defined by the relationships that God has created, by creating people in community, in society, that society is something essential to the divine purposes. And so, and Augustine lived that way. He lived for his friendships. One of the things you know most about Augustine are his friends. He writes about them, lives with them. He was the first of the bishops that I'm aware of to create a monastic community as a part of the papal palace, not the papal, excuse me, the bishop's palace, and lived in a monastic community. And it's interesting, go read his monastic code. You can find his monastic code online, just Google for it, the Augustinian code. It's a very simple, basic code. It's very different than a Benedictine code. Very straightforward, very simple, and it's very much around how do you live well together as a society. It's a lovely code, actually. I would recommend it for reflection upon. And so he sees it as something essential to our human nature and aspects. Sorry, so that was a soup question. I mean, it was worth a whole long conversation, and I've given just a little brief answer to something worth much more.
Thank you. Just moving on, Augustine comes up with the city of God. Luther comes up with two kingdoms to understand his world. And so the question is, how are these views similar to or different to how the church interprets or sees the world today? So I suppose a direct comparison with the outlook of the church today.
Well, okay. That is also a soup question, meaning one to come at the beginning. I'll just be brief about it, given our time and space. I won't take up Luther because of time, and also I know less about Luther. I'll stay with where I know more. I'd say, for one, we have not often been able to think in terms of this serious approach to the saeculum. Now, when I say we, let's first be careful and note that we have multiple different church communities and approaches and traditions. So there's so many different theological traditions probably represented within this room that I want to be very careful about stereotyping or generalizing. So I think I would ask you to consider, for each of you within your traditions, where it differs from your tradition. So that, is there a place for thinking about the benefits of participating in society? Or is there perhaps a move towards baptizing the world around us and treating it as part of the domain of the church and where the church ought to have activity? Not activities such as serving, but what part does the church play within formal organized society it is? What place does the church have in managing society? Not sure. And there are different questions there. How do we reflect upon that? So I hope you've gotten a little bit of a sense of how Augustine might handle that. What does your community do? Sorry, I haven't really answered that well because there's so many different answers to that amongst the church communities, probably represented in this room. Jonathan,
one final quick question. Well, it's not a quick question like all of these, but one that you can respond to briefly. So okay. You talk about history being non-canonical and in Augustine, and therefore this relativizing of our reading, of our approach to history, which Augustine invites us to engage with. Based on that, the questioner asks, what do you think are the shortcomings of Augustine's proposals? I guess, relativizing it, since you've already highlighted the positive side. Are there
Sure.
any? Is there anything wrong with Augustine, or is he just the perfect?
Well, he's not the canon either. Really important question. Augustine wrote in some ways that were, it's also part of the problem when you have somebody who's written a lot, has a long writing career and a great amount of writing, but the way he handled the state, particularly not so much in this work, but in other works where he was dealing with the Donatists and invited in with another church community called the Donatists, who had rejected most of the church and thought they were the small sliver of the true church. In the ways in which he responded to them and invited in the state to deal with one matter with them, he set up a justification that was used later by the Inquisition. And so there are many traditions and people who will remember Augustine negatively and despicably, because of the way in which he was used to justify the Inquisition. Now, I don't think Augustine would have accepted that, but it is one of the fruits of some of how he wrote, even though he didn't use that himself. Augustine, by the way, was against torture. He was also against the death penalty. He argued against that, both of the torture by the judicature, which was common. That's how court cases were decided. Truth was decided in Rome, and argued against the death penalty, which might surprise a number of Christian traditions. So Augustine has been used for ill, such as the Inquisition. I think Augustine, nonetheless, has not given us something that we can immediately think about how we use easily within societies that use different governance than Rome. And so I don't think it's immediately and absolutely the case that we just draw Augustine into British culture today, or we immediately and absolutely bring Augustine into Canadian culture or US culture in politics. Is we have to think through the principles underlying it to ask what aspects of it might be used to apply to the political systems that each of us experience. So I think there are limits there. The way in which there are pieces of Augustine that I don't tend to get into, even though the privation theory, I have to say I find very helpful for understanding the world. It's also what leads him into his doctrine of predestination. People often think that it's his view of the holiness of God. It's actually around his privation theory because of how that affects the soul's ability to respond to the divine if privated. Now I have real problems, I have to say, with that theological position. I struggle with it, and I wouldn't just take it as it comes out of Augustine, and yet it is something that can evolve out of his position, not necessarily must evolve out of it, but certainly can and did for Augustine. There are other positions one could challenge, but I'll leave that there given the shortness of the time.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, clearly the conversation could go on, but we must draw things to a close. Before I just do that, just a reminder, not all of you were here at the beginning, that if any of you would like to study with Skio on our online courses, those are starting shortly. Maybe Catherine will share our flyer on the chat, but you can go to our website. There it is. Thank you, Catherine. You can go to our website and find out more about what online offerings Skio has in the pipeline. Also, just to say that I will be repeating my C.S. Lewis talk. I'm aware that some who were interested in hearing it were not able to come. So I will watch this space, and you can check on our website again, and there will be more information about a repeat of my C.S. Lewis in Oxford talk, which will happen in a couple of weeks. So, let's thank you so much, Stan. That was a very stimulating talk. A bit of Augustine is always a very good thing in our lives. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you, all of you, for coming. Just to say, if you're a Skio alum, feel free, if you'd like, to stay online, and we'll be very happy to chat with you. But for the rest, many thanks, and have an excellent rest of your day.
Wow. Well, great to see folks.
Yes.
That was delightful, Stan.
Thanks, Bill. Great to see you. Bill's Bill is a faculty alum.
Yeah, I'm going to be sending some of my students to this talk, so hopefully there'll be a recording of it somewhere. We're reading Confessions right now, but here in the States, I think this is something that I want my first year